Case 1. Dr. D.R. Harrison. The woman writhed in agony as cancer consumed her body. Doctors had given her weeks to live. But Dr. D.R. Harrison promised something medical science couldn't deliver. A miracle, straight from the hand of God himself. "I can see the tumor," Harrison declared, his hands hovering over her abdomen. "The Lord is showing me exactly where the devil has planted his disease in your precious body." The crowd watched in breathless silence as Harrison pressed his hands against her stomach. Then, impossibly, his fingers seemed to penetrate her flesh without making any incision. The woman gasped as Harrison appeared to reach directly into her body cavity. "There!" Harrison shouted triumphantly, pulling his blood-soaked hands from her abdomen. "Behold the cancerous mass the Lord has removed!" In his palm sat a grotesque, bleeding mass of tissue. The crowd erupted in praise and worship. The woman wept tears of joy, believing she had witnessed divine surgery performed by Christ's chosen vessel. But that cancerous tumor was actually a chicken liver Harrison had concealed in bloody gauze, palmed through expert sleight of hand that would make any stage magician proud. The fake X-rays he displayed as proof of her healing had been doctored photographs purchased from medical supply companies. The woman died 3 weeks later, her real cancer untreated while she trusted in Harrison's theatrical deception. Her family buried her, still believing she had been healed by God's power, never knowing they had witnessed nothing more than a cruel magic trick designed to extract money from desperate believers. This was just the beginning of Christianity's most devastating deception, a century-long parade of false prophets who would weaponize humanity's deepest spiritual hopes to justify fraud, abuse, and mass murder on an unimaginable scale. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we investigate the most shocking betrayals of trust in criminal history. If you're fascinated by true crime documentaries that expose predators hiding behind positions of power, hit that subscribe button now. Today's investigation will expose 20 religious predators who weaponized faith itself as their primary tool of deception. These so-called healers convinced millions of desperate believers to surrender their money, their health, and sometimes their lives, all while performing elaborate theatrical frauds disguised as divine miracles. Case 2. Wayne Bent. Wayne Bent had convinced his followers that he was the returned Messiah, leading a small but devoted congregation called the Lord Our Righteousness Church in the remote New Mexico wilderness. This charismatic leader promised his disciples that the world would end on a specific date, and only those living under his divine protection would survive God's final judgment. But Bent's most sinister manipulation involved his claimed ability to heal through divine power transfer. He taught his isolated followers that certain spiritual ailments, particularly those affecting teenage girls, required direct physical contact with their Messiah to channel God's healing energy through his sinless body. Parents voluntarily brought their daughters to Bent's private quarters, believing they were offering their children the ultimate spiritual blessing. Bent claimed divine revelation instructed him to perform these healings by lying naked in bed with the young girls, explaining that skin-to-skin contact was necessary for God's power to flow from his divine body into their corrupted flesh. When authorities investigated reports of child abuse within the compound, they discovered that Bent's healing ceremonies were actually systematic sexual exploitation disguised as religious ritual. The girls had been taught that resisting their Messiah's touch meant rejecting God's healing power and condemning themselves to eternal damnation. In 2008, Wayne Bent was convicted on multiple felony charges related to sexual contact with minors and contributing to the delinquency of children. The court sentenced him to 18 years in prison, proving that even self-proclaimed messiahs must face earthly consequences for crimes against children. Bent served 10 years before his release in 2018, leaving behind a trail of psychologically damaged children who had been taught to accept sexual abuse as divine healing, and devastated parents who realized they had voluntarily delivered their daughters to a predator claiming Christ's authority. Case 3. Clifton Harris. Clifton Harris built his reputation as an associate of the famous A. Allen, stunning audiences with his uncanny ability to receive divine revelations about strangers in his congregation. Night after night, Harris would call out specific individuals, accurately describing their medical conditions, family problems, and personal struggles with supernatural precision that left believers convinced they were witnessing genuine prophetic power. "Sister, you've been suffering from diabetes for 7 years," Harris would declare, pointing to a woman in the crowd. "And brother, your wife left you last Tuesday because of your drinking problem." The accuracy was so startling that even skeptics found themselves questioning whether they were witnessing genuine divine communication. In the 1970s, a local news team decided to investigate Harris's seemingly impossible accuracy by planting a reporter in his audience with a fabricated medical condition. They carefully documented every detail of the fake ailment to test whether Harris would, somehow, receive this false information from God. During the service, Harris accurately described the planted reporter's fake condition in perfect detail. But when investigators analyzed their audio recordings, they made a devastating discovery. Just moments before Harris spoke each divine revelation, his wife's voice could be faintly heard through the sound system, whispering the exact information he would soon claim to receive supernaturally. The investigation revealed that Harris's wife positioned herself backstage with a hidden microphone, reading information from prayer cards that audience members had filled out before the service. She fed this intelligence to her husband through a concealed earpiece, allowing him to present stolen personal details as messages directly from the throne of God. The audio evidence completely destroyed Harris's credibility and exposed the systematic fraud behind his prophetic ministry. His congregation abandoned him virtually overnight, and his reputation never recovered from the undeniable proof that his divine revelations were nothing more than cleverly orchestrated deception using basic sound equipment. Case 4. Hobart Freeman. Hobart Freeman didn't claim to perform dramatic healings on stage. Instead, he taught something far more dangerous: that seeking medical treatment was a sin that demonstrated lack of faith in God's healing power. His Faith Assembly Church in Indiana became ground zero for one of the most lethal religious doctrines in American history. Freeman convinced his followers that doctors, hospitals, and medications were Satan's tools, designed to prevent true believers from experiencing God's miraculous healing power. He taught that visiting a physician showed distrust in divine providence and would actually block God's ability to heal their bodies through faith alone. Parents watched their diabetic children slip into comas rather than administer insulin. Cancer patients refused chemotherapy and died in agony while praying for divine intervention. Pregnant women gave birth without medical assistance, leading to complications that killed both mothers and babies. Freeman praised these deaths as martyrdom for the faith. Investigators later documented over 90 preventable deaths among Freeman's congregation, including numerous children who died from easily treatable conditions like pneumonia, appendicitis, and diabetes. Medical examiners confirmed that basic medical intervention could have saved virtually every victim of Freeman's deadly doctrine. In 1984, Hobart Freeman himself developed gangrene in his leg, a condition requiring immediate amputation to prevent death. True to his own teachings, Freeman refused medical treatment and died from the infection, proving that even false prophets cannot escape the biological realities they convince their followers to ignore. Freeman's death ended his ministry, but not the suffering he had caused. Survivors spent decades recovering from the trauma of watching loved ones die needlessly, while some families remained split between those who escaped his influence and those who continued rejecting medical care even after their leader's hypocritical death proved his doctrine false. Case 5. Leroy Jenkins. Leroy Jenkins was impossible to ignore, a flamboyant regional evangelist whose theatrical healing services attracted thousands of believers seeking divine intervention. His trademark style involved dramatically calling out specific individuals from the crowd, revealing intimate details about their lives and medical conditions with startling accuracy that convinced audiences they were witnessing genuine prophetic revelation. Before each healing service, Jenkins required all attendees to fill out detailed prayer cards listing their ailments, family problems, and specific prayer requests. Ushers collected these cards, ostensibly for the evangelist's prayer time, but actually to provide Jenkins with a comprehensive database of personal information about everyone in his audience. In the 1980s, WSB-TV in Atlanta decided to expose Jenkins by sending an undercover reporter with a hidden camera to one of his crusades. The investigative team carefully documented the fake medical condition they had invented for their planted journalist, then waited to see if Jenkins would somehow receive this fabricated information through divine revelation. During the service, Jenkins dramatically called out the undercover reporter, accurately describing the completely fictional ailment she had written on her prayer card with perfect precision. The hidden camera footage provided undeniable proof that Jenkins was simply reading the personal information that attendees had voluntarily provided, then presenting it as supernatural knowledge received from God. The exposure of his healing fraud was just the beginning of Jenkins' criminal downfall. His increasingly erratic behavior eventually led to far more serious charges when he was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in connection with a plot against one of his critics, proving that false prophets often escalate from financial fraud to violent crime. Jenkins' conviction and imprisonment completely destroyed his ministry and exposed the systematic fraud behind his claimed supernatural abilities. His case became a template for understanding how healing evangelists exploit the vulnerability of desperate believers through carefully orchestrated deception disguised as divine intervention. Case 6. Angelica Zambrano. Angelica Zambrano represents the evolution of healing fraud into the digital age, where unverifiable claims can spread globally through social media without traditional gatekeepers. This Ecuadorian visionary has built an international following by claiming she has visited both hell and heaven multiple times and has personally raised the dead through divine power channeled directly from Jesus Christ. Zambrano's detailed descriptions of her supernatural journeys captivate millions of online followers who share her videos across religious social networks. She claims to have witnessed famous celebrities burning in hell and describes elaborate conversations with Jesus about humanity's eternal destiny, positioning herself as God's exclusive messenger to the modern world. Most audaciously, Zambrano claims to have raised multiple people from the dead through prayer and divine intervention. However, she never provides names, medical records, or verifiable documentation of these alleged resurrections. The miracles exist only in her testimonies, which circulate endlessly through religious echo chambers that never demand proof. Investigators comparing Zambrano's detailed visions with other hell visitation testimonies discovered striking similarities, nearly identical descriptions of hell's geography, the same celebrity sightings, and matching conversations with Jesus. Her supposedly unique divine revelations were actually recycled content from earlier prophetic figures, repackaged for a new generation of believers. Unlike traditional healing evangelists who faced live audiences, Zambrano operates primarily through digital platforms that make verification impossible. Her followers donate money for her ministry, based entirely on unsubstantiated claims that can never be disproven, because the alleged miracles occur in private settings without witnesses or documentation. Zambrano continues touring internationally, collecting donations and spreading influence through carefully produced videos that make supernatural fraud more accessible than ever before. Her success demonstrates how digital technology enables false prophets to reach millions of vulnerable believers while avoiding the scrutiny that traditional media once provided. Case 7. A.L. Valdez. A.L. Valdez worked alongside the legendary Oral Roberts during the height of the 1950s healing revival movement, stunning audiences with his ability to receive spontaneous divine revelations about complete strangers in his congregation. Night after night, Valdez would walk through crowds and accurately identify people's medical conditions, personal struggles, and family secrets with supernatural precision. The fraud behind Valdez's spontaneous miracles was eventually exposed not by skeptical journalists, but by Gordon Lindsay, a respected insider within the healing revival movement itself. Lindsay's devastating account revealed the systematic deception that had fooled millions of sincere believers seeking genuine divine intervention. Lindsay documented how Valdez employed a network of discerners, trained assistants, who mingled with crowds for hours before each healing service. These operatives engaged attendees in seemingly casual conversations, skillfully extracting personal information about medical conditions, family problems, and financial struggles, while appearing to offer friendly fellowship. The discerners presented themselves as fellow believers, sharing testimonies and prayer requests, but they were actually conducting sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. They memorized details about dozens of potential healing candidates, then discreetly passed this information to Valdez before the service began. Armed with detailed personal information about audience members, Valdez could walk through crowds and appear to receive supernatural knowledge about strangers. His spontaneous healings were actually carefully planned performances based on intelligence gathered through systematic deception disguised as Christian fellowship. Lindsay's insider account confirmed that this fraudulent methodology was widespread throughout the healing revival movement, involving multiple major evangelists beyond just Valdez. The revelation that spontaneous divine revelations were actually products of organized deception created a credibility crisis that damaged the entire industry for decades. Case 8. Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Baker Eddy didn't operate tent revivals or stage theatrical healings. Instead, she founded Christian Science, an entire denomination built around the principle that physical illness is merely an illusion that can be overcome through prayer alone. Her institutional approach to faith healing created a systematic framework that has caused preventable deaths for over a century. Eddy's doctrine teaches that seeking medical treatment demonstrates lack of faith in God's healing power and can actually prevent divine healing from occurring. Christian Science practitioners are trained to counsel members away from medical intervention, convincing them that spiritual treatment through prayer is not only superior, but the only truly effective healing method. The Christian Science Church publishes unverified testimonies of miraculous healings in its official periodicals, creating institutional pressure for members to claim healing victories even when their conditions worsen. Followers learn that admitting continued illness means acknowledging spiritual failure, leading many to deny obvious medical crises. Court records document numerous cases where Christian Science parents watched their children die from easily treatable conditions like diabetes, appendicitis, and pneumonia, rather than seek medical care. These preventable tragedies occur because parents genuinely believe that calling a doctor would demonstrate lack of faith and block God's healing power. The Church has faced dozens of wrongful death lawsuits from families whose loved ones died after following Christian Science doctrine instead of seeking medical treatment. Courts have repeatedly found that the Church's systematic discouragement of medical care directly contributes to preventable deaths, particularly among children. Despite overwhelming evidence of the deadly consequences, Christian Science continues operating exactly as Eddy designed it, maintaining institutional policies that pressure members to reject life-saving medical treatment. The organization's persistence in promoting dangerous health practices represents one of the longest-running institutional frauds in religious history. Survivors describe the psychological trauma of being raised in an environment where acknowledging illness was treated as spiritual weakness, and where seeking medical help meant betraying God Himself. creating generations of people damaged by an institutional system that prioritizes theological purity over human life. Case 9. William Branham. William Branham became a foundational figure in Pentecostal healing circles by claiming that a supernatural pillar of fire followed him wherever he ministered, serving as visible proof of God's anointing on his healing ministry. His fame exploded when he produced a photograph allegedly showing this divine manifestation hovering above his head during a revival service. The photograph showed what appeared to be a brilliant column of light descending from heaven directly onto Branham's head while he preached. Believers treated the image as undeniable proof that God's power rested on their chosen vessel, and Branham used the photograph to validate his claims of supernatural healing abilities for decades. Branham's healing services featured his uncanny ability to call out specific individuals and reveal intimate details about their lives, medical conditions, and personal struggles. He claimed these revelations came through divine discernment, positioning himself as a prophet who received direct communication from God about each person's spiritual and physical needs. Professional photographers eventually analyzed Branham's famous pillar of fire image and conclusively identified it as either a double exposure or a developing flaw, common technical problems in 1950s photography that could easily create the illusion of supernatural light. The supposedly divine manifestation was actually an accidental photographic artifact. Investigators also discovered that Branham's supernatural discernment followed the same pattern as other healing fraudsters. His assistants collected detailed prayer cards before services, providing him with comprehensive personal information about audience members that he later presented as revelations received directly from God's throne. Despite overwhelming evidence debunking his supernatural claims, Branham retains devoted followers who reject scientific analysis of his fraudulent methods. His influence on modern Pentecostal theology remains significant, proving how false prophets can maintain religious authority even after their deception has been thoroughly exposed by objective investigation. Branham's teachings continue influencing millions of believers worldwide, demonstrating how religious movements can become permanently corrupted when their foundational claims are based on photographic manipulation and systematic fraud rather than genuine spiritual experience. Case 10. Uri Geller. Uri Geller pioneered a unique approach to healing fraud by positioning himself as a secular psychic rather than a religious figure, yet employing identical methods to faith healers while claiming supernatural powers that transcended traditional religious boundaries. His spoon-bending demonstrations and psychic healing claims attracted millions of believers who thought they were witnessing genuine paranormal abilities. Geller claimed his psychic energy could heal physical ailments through mental focus and supernatural force. He conducted healing sessions where audience members reported miraculous recoveries from chronic conditions, positioning himself as a bridge between scientific possibility and spiritual intervention without requiring religious faith. Major television networks featured Geller's demonstrations, lending credibility to his claims through mainstream media exposure. His ability to bend spoons and describe hidden objects convinced millions of viewers that they were witnessing genuine psychic phenomena, creating a global following that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Professional magician and skeptic James Randi conducted methodical investigations of Geller's claims, ultimately demonstrating that every psychic ability could be replicated through simple magic tricks and psychological manipulation. Randi proved that spoon-bending was basic sleight of hand, and that Geller's mind reading relied on cold reading techniques. When television producers implemented proper controls to prevent trickery, Geller's abilities mysteriously failed. Under conditions that eliminated the possibility of deception, he could not bend spoons, read minds, or perform any of the supernatural feats that had made him internationally famous. Geller's exposure became the definitive case study in psychic fraud, revealing how charismatic performers could convince intelligent people that they possessed supernatural healing powers through nothing more than practiced deception and media manipulation. Geller became the poster child for fraudulent psychic claims, proving that healing fraud extends far beyond religious contexts and that the same manipulative techniques work equally well whether the performer claims divine anointing or psychic ability. The deception remains identical regardless of its supposed supernatural source. Case 11. A. Allen. A. Allen became one of the most influential figures in the healing revival movement by making the most audacious claims possible that he could grow new limbs for amputees through divine power. His miracle revivals attracted desperate people from across America who had lost arms or legs and believed they were about to witness the ultimate demonstration of God's healing power. Allen regularly announced from his pulpit that God was growing new limbs for amputees in his audience. He would call forward people missing arms or legs, pray over them dramatically, then declare that divine regeneration was occurring at that very moment through his anointed ministry. Despite his confident proclamations, the regenerated limbs were never actually visible to anyone. Allen explained that the new appendages existed spiritually and would manifest physically over time, or that sensitive believers could feel buds beginning to form, where missing limbs would eventually grow back to full size. Desperate amputees traveled hundreds of miles and spent their life savings attending Allen's crusades, believing they were investing in their only chance to regain lost limbs. Allen collected massive offerings from these vulnerable people while providing nothing but empty promises of impossible biological regeneration. Allen's credibility suffered a devastating blow when he was arrested for driving under the influence, exposing his hypocrisy as he claimed divine healing power while battling alcohol addiction. The man who promised to regenerate other people's missing body parts couldn't even heal his own substance abuse problems. The DUI arrest was followed by additional scandals involving financial misconduct and personal moral failures that completely destroyed Allen's reputation among his followers. His ministry collapsed as believers realized that their supposedly anointed healer was just another fraudulent evangelist exploiting their disabilities for profit. Allen's false promises left behind a trail of psychologically devastated amputees who had believed they were about to experience miraculous limb regeneration, only to discover that their disability remained unchanged, while their financial resources had been systematically drained by a drunk charlatan claiming divine power. Case 12. Ray Macaulay. Ray Macaulay built one of South Africa's largest Pentecostal churches by promoting faith healing during the country's devastating HIV-AIDS crisis. As millions of desperately poor South Africans faced death from a disease they couldn't afford to treat, Macaulay offered them something that seemed like salvation, the promise that faith alone could cure AIDS better than any medication. Macaulay's theology taught that HIV-AIDS could be completely healed through prayer and faith, making expensive antiretroviral medications unnecessary for true believers. His sermons convinced thousands of infected followers that taking medicine demonstrated lack of faith in God's healing power and would actually prevent divine intervention. HIV-positive congregants stopped taking life-saving antiretroviral drugs after Macaulay's healings, believing they had been cured through divine intervention. Pregnant women refused medications that could prevent transmitting HIV to their unborn children, trusting that God would protect their babies through faith alone. Health organizations documented a direct correlation between Macaulay's healing crusades and increased HIV transmission rates, along with preventable AIDS deaths among his congregation. Families watched loved ones waste away from opportunistic infections while refusing medical treatment, believing that seeking doctors would demonstrate spiritual weakness. Medical professionals and international health organizations condemned Macaulay's teachings as a public health catastrophe that was systematically undermining HIV prevention efforts throughout South Africa. His influence was directly contributing to the spread of AIDS in communities that desperately needed accurate medical information. Despite overwhelming evidence that his teachings were causing mass casualties, Macaulay continued promoting faith healing over medical treatment for HIV-AIDS. His persistence in spreading deadly medical misinformation represents one of the most destructive examples of healing fraud in modern history. Macaulay's false healings created thousands of AIDS orphans whose parents died after abandoning medical treatment in favor of prayer, leaving behind children who would grow up knowing their parents had been killed by fraudulent promises of divine healing disguised as Christian ministry. Case 13. Catherine Kuhlman. Catherine Kuhlman became the most influential female evangelist in history by perfecting the art of psychological manipulation disguised as divine healing. Her miracle services attracted hundreds of thousands of believers who witnessed dramatic scenes of people falling backward, slain in the spirit, and claiming instantaneous healing from chronic conditions. Kuhlman's services were carefully orchestrated emotional experiences featuring dramatic music, intense lighting, and her hypnotic preaching style that created powerful psychological states in vulnerable audience members. The atmosphere was designed to produce heightened emotional responses that participants interpreted as encounters with divine power. During her healing services, Kuhlman would declare that God was healing specific conditions throughout the audience, causing people to believe they were experiencing miraculous recovery. The combination of group psychology, emotional manipulation, and her authoritative declarations created mass suggestion events where participants genuinely felt temporary relief from their symptoms. Kuhlman's signature move involved touching people's foreheads, causing them to fall backward dramatically while claiming to be slain in the spirit. This theatrical element convinced audiences they were witnessing supernatural power, when actually they were observing psychological manipulation combined with social pressure to conform to expected behaviors. Independent medical investigations of Kuhlman's claimed healings revealed that the vast majority of her miraculous cures were either temporary psychosomatic improvements or complete fabrications. Patients who claimed to be healed during her services still required ongoing medical treatment for their unchanged conditions. Despite her massive influence and international reputation, Kuhlman never produced a single medically verified healing that could withstand scientific scrutiny. Her entire ministry was built on emotional manipulation that created temporary psychological relief but no genuine medical improvement. Kuhlman's methods became the template for modern healing evangelists, who understood that sophisticated psychological manipulation could be more effective than crude theatrical tricks. Her techniques continue influencing contemporary healing ministries that prioritize emotional manipulation over actual medical intervention. Case 14. Ernest Angley. Ernest Angley built a decades-long television ministry by performing some of the most grotesque healing frauds ever broadcast into American homes. His signature technique involved violently pushing people's foreheads while claiming to draw out cancers and other diseases through supernatural force, often culminating in theatrical displays where he pretended to vomit the extracted illnesses into a cloth. Angley's healing method was physically aggressive, involving forceful contact that often knocked elderly and disabled people backward. He claimed this violent touch was necessary to channel God's power and extract demonic diseases that had invaded his followers' bodies through spiritual warfare. During his television broadcasts, Angley would suddenly double over and appear to vomit violently into a white cloth, claiming he was expelling cancerous demons that God had transferred from his patients into his own body. He would display the soiled cloth as proof that supernatural surgery had just occurred through his anointed ministry. Beyond his cancer-vomiting spectacle, Angley regularly claimed to have raised people from the dead through his healing power. However, he never provided names, medical records, or any verifiable documentation of these alleged resurrections, making his claims impossible to investigate or confirm. Medical professionals pointed out that Angley's claimed ability to physically extract diseases through touch and then vomit them was biologically impossible. Cancer cannot be transferred between bodies through physical contact, and diseases do not manifest as demons that can be literally expelled through regurgitation. Angley faced numerous lawsuits from former followers who claimed his violent healing methods had caused them physical injury rather than divine healing. Critical media reports documented his fraudulent practices and the financial exploitation that funded his extravagant lifestyle. Angley's case demonstrated how television broadcasting could amplify healing fraud to unprecedented levels, allowing one charlatan to deceive millions of viewers simultaneously while performing impossible medical claims that would be immediately exposed under proper scientific observation. Case 15. Todd Bentley. Todd Bentley exploded onto the international healing scene in 2008 as the leader of the Florida Healing Outpouring, a revival movement that attracted thousands of desperate believers to Lakeland, Florida. His healing style was shockingly violent, involving kicking, punching, and body slamming people, while claiming that aggressive physical force was necessary to break demonic strongholds and release divine healing power. Bentley's healing technique involved kicking elderly women in the face, punching men in the stomach, and forcefully throwing disabled people to the ground. He justified this brutality by claiming that violent physical contact was required to break through spiritual resistance and force healing to occur in stubborn cases. Despite the dramatic physical violence and emotional intensity of his healing services, Bentley's claimed healings involved primarily subjective conditions like chronic pain, depression, and vague spiritual ailments that could not be medically verified. His followers reported feeling better emotionally, but showed no evidence of actual physical healing. When Bentley did address specific medical conditions, he focused on easily faked ailments like back pain, headaches, and mobility issues that could appear to improve temporarily through adrenaline and psychological suggestion. He avoided attempting to heal obvious disabilities or medically verifiable conditions that would expose his fraud. Bentley's ministry collapsed spectacularly when revelations emerged of his extramarital affair and systematic financial misconduct. The man who claimed divine authority to violently assault people in God's name was simultaneously violating his marriage vows and stealing money from his devoted followers. The exposure of Bentley's personal moral failures combined with growing scrutiny of his violent healing methods led to the complete collapse of his international ministry. His case became a cautionary tale about how false healers often escalate to physical violence when their deception requires increasingly extreme measures. Bentley's downfall discredited the entire Florida Healing Outpouring movement, revealing how desperate believers had mistaken physical assault and emotional manipulation for divine intervention, proving that even violent abuse could be disguised as healing ministry when performed by charismatic manipulators. Case 16. Marjo Gortner. Marjo Gortner became the most damaging whistleblower in healing evangelist history when he exposed the systematic fraud behind Pentecostal ministry in his 1972 Oscar-winning documentary, Marjo. Unlike other cases where fraud was discovered by outsiders, Gortner voluntarily confessed to decades of deliberate deception while demonstrating exactly how he had fooled millions of believers. Gortner began preaching at age 4, trained by his parents to perform elaborate religious theater for audiences who believed they were witnessing a child prodigy anointed by God. He learned to manipulate emotions, fake spiritual experiences, and extract money from vulnerable believers before he was old enough to understand the moral implications of his actions. In the documentary, Gortner demonstrated how speaking in tongues was complete fabrication, showing viewers how to produce convincing fake glossolalia by combining emotional intensity with meaningless syllables. His live demonstration proved that this cornerstone of Pentecostal experience was nothing more than learned performance art. Gortner revealed how his team systematically gathered personal information about audience members before services through casual conversations and prayer requests. This intelligence was then fed to him during services, allowing him to present stolen personal details as divine revelations received directly from God's throne. The documentary showed exactly how evangelists manipulated audiences into donating far beyond their means through emotional blackmail, false urgency, and promises of divine financial return. Gortner demonstrated the psychological techniques that convinced poor people to give their last dollars to wealthy preachers. Gortner's confession provided the most comprehensive insider account of healing fraud ever documented, revealing that virtually every aspect of Pentecostal healing ministry involved systematic deception. His testimony devastated the credibility of the entire healing revival movement. Marjoe became the definitive exposé of healing fraud, providing undeniable proof from an industry insider that the entire Pentecostal healing movement was built on deliberate deception rather than genuine spiritual experience, fundamentally changing how the public viewed religious healing claims. Case 17. Oral Roberts. Oral Roberts became the most recognizable face of televangelism through his pioneering healing ministry, but his reputation was permanently destroyed by one of the most audacious fundraising schemes in religious history. In 1987, Roberts claimed that a 900-foot-tall Jesus had appeared to him with a divine ultimatum that would define televangelism corruption for generations. Roberts announced to his television audience that Jesus Christ had appeared to him as a 900-foot-tall giant and delivered a specific financial demand. Roberts must raise $8 million within 1 year, or God would call him home, essentially threatening Roberts' death if viewers didn't donate enough money to his ministry. The fundraising appeal transformed Jesus Christ into a cosmic extortionist who would murder his own chosen evangelist unless desperate viewers surrendered their life savings. Roberts presented this threat as a divine revelation, making resistance to his financial demands equivalent to defying God's direct commands. Roberts exploited his decades-long relationship with loyal viewers who had grown to love him through his television ministry. His threat of divine execution unless they donated created emotional trauma among elderly followers who felt personally responsible for keeping their beloved preacher alive through their sacrificial giving. The 900-foot Jesus campaign triggered massive public ridicule and media criticism that permanently damaged televangelism's credibility. Even committed Christians were appalled by Roberts' transformation of their savior into a money-demanding giant who threatened murder over fundraising quotas. Roberts' extortion scheme became the defining scandal that ended the public's willingness to trust televangelists with their money. His case proved that healing ministries inevitably evolved into sophisticated financial fraud operations that exploited religious devotion for personal enrichment. The phrase 900-foot Jesus became a permanent punchline that summarized everything corrupt about televangelism. Roberts had successfully transformed himself from a respected healing minister into a laughingstock, whose legacy would forever represent the cynical exploitation of sincere religious faith for monetary gain. Case 18. Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson transformed from a failed businessman into one of America's most powerful religious figures through the 700 Club, his daily television program that reached millions of viewers seeking divine healing through their television screens. His influence extended far beyond entertainment, into politics and social policy, making his healing fraud particularly dangerous for public discourse. During regular 700 Club broadcasts, Robertson would suddenly declare that God was revealing specific healings occurring among his television audience. He would announce that viewers with particular medical conditions were being healed at that very moment through the power transmitted through their television sets. In one documented case, Robertson confidently announced on live television that God was healing a man of a hernia somewhere in the viewing audience. He described the healing in vivid detail, claiming divine revelation showed him the exact nature of the man's condition and the miraculous repair occurring through supernatural intervention. Journalists investigating Robertson's healing claims tracked down the man Robertson claimed had been healed of his hernia. Medical examination revealed that the man's hernia remained completely unchanged and still required surgical intervention to prevent serious complications. When confronted with medical evidence disproving his healing claim, Robertson's organization claimed the incident was a misunderstanding and suggested that spiritual healing sometimes occurred gradually or in ways that weren't immediately medically apparent. They refused to acknowledge that no healing had actually occurred. This documented failure represented just one example of Robertson's regular practice of claiming divine healings that could never be medically verified. His television program continued broadcasting identical healing claims for decades, despite consistent failure to produce genuine medical improvements. Robertson's massive media empire and political influence protected him from the scrutiny that destroyed other healing fraudsters. His case demonstrated how institutional power could enable false healers to continue operating despite overwhelming evidence of systematic deception. Robertson's healing fraud continued unabated throughout his career, proving that some false healers become too politically and financially powerful to face consequences for their systematic exploitation of desperate believers seeking divine intervention. Case 19. Peter Popoff. Peter Popoff became one of the most spectacularly exposed healing fraudsters in history through his uncanny ability to call out complete strangers in his audience and reveal intimate details about their medical conditions, family situations, and personal struggles with supernatural accuracy that convinced millions they were witnessing genuine prophetic revelation. Night after night, Popoff would walk through packed auditoriums and accurately identify people by name, describing their exact medical conditions, home addresses, and family problems with startling precision. His followers genuinely believed they were witnessing a modern-day prophet receiving direct communication from God's throne. Professional magician and skeptic James Randi became suspicious of Popoff's impossibly accurate revelations and decided to investigate using electronic surveillance equipment. Randi's team attended multiple Popoff services while monitoring radio frequencies to detect any possible electronic communication. Randi's investigation revealed that Popoff was receiving detailed information through a tiny radio receiver hidden in his ear. His wife, Elizabeth, sat backstage with prayer cards that audience members had filled out before the service, feeding her husband personal information about each potential healing candidate through wireless transmission. Randi exposed Popoff's fraud on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, playing actual audio recordings of Elizabeth Popoff's voice transmitting personal information to her husband during supposedly divine revelations. The evidence was absolutely conclusive and undeniable. The exposure destroyed Popoff's ministry virtually overnight, as his followers realized they had been systematically deceived by basic radio technology disguised as divine communication. His television broadcasts were canceled, and his fundraising operations collapsed immediately. Despite his complete exposure, Popoff eventually staged a successful comeback by targeting different audiences and using more sophisticated technology. His return proved that healing fraud could survive even the most devastating public exposure, when new generations of vulnerable believers remained unaware of documented deception. Popoff's case demonstrated how healing fraudsters adapt their methods to incorporate new technology while maintaining the same fundamental deception, exploiting human vulnerability through false claims of supernatural knowledge and divine healing power. Case 20. Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn became the most globally recognized healing evangelist of the modern era through his spectacular Holy Spirit demonstrations where thousands of people would simultaneously fall backward after he gestured toward them. His crusades in packed stadiums worldwide created the impression that audiences were witnessing unprecedented displays of divine power. Hin's signature technique involved dramatically waving his jacket or blowing towards sections of his audience, causing entire rows of people to fall backwards simultaneously as if struck by invisible supernatural force. These coordinated falling displays convinced viewers they were witnessing the Holy Spirit moving through the crowd. Investigative reports revealed that Hin's organization employed teams of trained ushers positioned strategically throughout venues to catch falling audience members and guide their movements. These assistants created a choreographed environment where falling became expected behavior that participants felt pressured to perform. Despite decades of healing crusades, Hin's claimed miraculous healings consistently involved subjective conditions like pain relief, emotional problems, or vague spiritual ailments that could never be medically verified. Independent medical follow-ups found no evidence of genuine physical healing among his claimed miracle recipients. Investigative journalists documented numerous cases where people Hin had declared healed during his crusades continued requiring ongoing medical treatment for their unchanged conditions. Some died from illnesses Hin had publicly claimed God had cured through his ministry. Hin's lavish lifestyle, funded by donations from desperate poor people seeking healing, became the subject of congressional investigation. His private jets, luxury homes, and expensive clothing contrasted sharply with the poverty of followers who sacrificed their last dollars believing in his healing promises. Hin made numerous specific prophetic predictions that failed to materialize, including claims about mass resurrections and detailed end-times prophecies. His willingness to walk back failed predictions while making new claims demonstrated the systematic dishonesty underlying his entire ministry. Despite constant criticism and extensive documentation of his fraudulent methods, Hin continues operating internationally, proving that some healing fraudsters become too institutionally powerful to stop, regardless of overwhelming evidence of their systematic deception. 20 predators who weaponize humanity's deepest hope, the promise of divine healing for desperate suffering. Every case follows an identical progression. Charismatic leader claims exclusive divine healing power, isolates followers from medical reality, demands absolute faith over evidence, then reveals that God requires financial sacrifice for healing to occur. These weren't random charlatans, but calculating predators who understood exactly how to corrupt genuine faith into justification for exploitation and death. Have you encountered religious leaders who discouraged medical treatment while promising divine healing? What warning signs have you observed that might indicate healing fraud in your community? Have you or someone you know been pressured to donate money as proof of faith in healing promises? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your insights could help others recognize these deadly patterns before they claim more innocent lives. What advice would you give to families dealing with loved ones caught in healing ministries that discourage medical care? Subscribe to Savage Case Files for more investigations into those who betray our deepest trust. Because the most dangerous predators aren't hiding in shadows. They're standing in spotlights, claiming divine authority while systematically destroying the people who trust them most.